Alright, I went back to the old way here because the computer kept freezing. So I wanted to kind of make sure that we're all literally and metaphorically on the same page, that the world was made for humans, and the story that we've told ourselves, the story that we've been participating in, to use Ishmaelian language here, is that we're at war with the world, right? That if everything's made for us, which we think it is as takers, and if we're supposed to turn it into a paradise, which we think we're supposed to, well, then why hasn't that happened, right? Why hasn't that happened? Well, it's happened, right, and this is on page 82 in my book. So far we have this much. The world was made for humans to conquer and rule, and under human rule it was meant to become a paradise. This is clearly to be followed by a but. It has always been followed by a but. This is because takers have always perceived the world was far short of the paradise it was meant to be, right? So in thinking about the idea that the takers always thought that we could have more, that we could experience more, that we could turn this world into what it was made to be, which it was made for us, right? So we have the ability to turn it into paradise. But what has always gone wrong here? Under human rule, the world should have become paradise, but people screwed it up. Why'd they screw it up? Because, right, and this is where I think an interesting part of the story goes, we're bound to screw it up. It's because there's something fundamentally wrong with humans, right? And this is part of the story, the takers, us, that we tell each other. Something that definitely works against paradise, something that makes people stupid and destructive and greedy and short-sighted. Of course, everyone in your culture knows this. Humans were born to turn the world into a paradise, but tragically, they were born flawed. And so this paradise has always been spoiled by stupidity, greed, destructiveness, and short-sightedness. That's right. And so continuing on here, and then Ishmael says at the very end of section 3 of chapter 5, right, is that in a way, this kind of self-imposed way of thinking of well, we're just screwed up, we'll never get it right. And you can notice here the conflicting ideology of okay, well, the world was made for us, so we can do whatever we damn well please, and that's our right because we're takers, everything's made for us, blah, 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 we're the pinnacle of evolution, blah, 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 right? That's how things came to be this way. But then also, kind of contrary to that, we'll never actually succeed because we're fundamentally flawed, right? Those are competing ideologies. Those are competing notions almost, right? And we have to figure out a way to reconcile that. We have to figure out a way to reconcile those kind of competing ideologies. And in a way, right, and I think this is where it goes in Ishmael, this idea that we're flawed and we'll never get it right kind of lets us off the hook, right? It excuses us for destroying the world because that's part of our right to destroy the world because we can do whatever we damn well please, right? So on the face of it, they might seem contradictory, but actually one lets us off the hook for the other. Okay? And also Ishmael says this on page 84, and so this is chapter 5. Chapter 5, section 3. Ishmael says, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with people. Given a story to enact that puts them in accord with the world, they will live in accord with the world. But given a story to enact that puts them at odds with the world, as ours does, as the takers do, then they will live at odds with the world. Given a story to enact in which they are lords of the world, they will act like lords of the world, and given a story to enact that the world is a foe to be conquered, they will conquer it like a foe, and one day inevitably their foe will lie, this gets dramatic, I don't want to, lies bleeding to death at their feet as the world is now. That's just a little too dramatic for me. But Ishmael, what he's claiming here, right, what he's claiming here is the idea that we've been told a story, and remember that a story is an explanation in relating humans, the gods, and the world, right? We've been told a story where we are fundamentally flawed. And you can think about this in a lot of major religions. You can think about this in terms of other ways of thinking that, it kind of lets us off the hook. But maybe we're not actually flawed. Again, maybe it's just part of a story that we've been telling ourselves. Okay? All right. Blah, blah, blah. So section 4, they kind of keep filling it in here. Okay? Again, all of this idea of thinking about, well, how did things come to be this way? Okay. And in section 4, we get a pretty provocative claim. Okay? And this is section 4, chapter 5. This is where Ishmael and the narrator are having this conversation of thinking about, well, why is it that we have so many prophets in our culture, in the taker culture, right? Why do we have so many prophets, right? We have influence of Moses, Buddha, Confucius, Jesus, Muhammad, and taker history is simply enormous. I'm sure you're aware of that, right? But why is that the case, right? Why is it the case that we have so much outlook and so much kind of engagement with these prophets, right? And the narrator, I think, rightly says, and I think that many people, perhaps you believe in one of these prophets to kind of help guide your life, give your life richness and meaning. But essentially, maybe you don't either. But essentially, right, we have prophets to tell us how it is we ought to live. Okay? They're here to straighten us out and tell us how it is we ought to live. And then Ishmael, I think, rightly says, but why? Why do you need prophets to tell you how it is you ought to live? Why do you need anyone to tell you how it is you ought to live? Okay? And that's really challenging, right? Especially if one does kind of hold to a religious outlook that does connect with this notion of having a guide, of having a prophet to, again, kind of help us navigate through the world, right? But it's challenging, right? Because you would think that after all this, after millennia of years, after, civilization after civilization, we probably have some response to this question that we probably should have figured it out by now. Why do you need anyone to tell you? Why do you need anyone to tell you how you ought to live? Right? And then on the next page here, right? The idea that, well, it's a good question. I'd say, look, it's okay, blah, blah, blah. We can argue about it for 1,000 years, but there's never going to be an argument powerful enough to end an argument about whatever hot-button issue we might be talking about. So it's impossible to know what we should do. That's why we need the prophets. The prophet knows, right? And Ishmael says, okay, sure, but why don't you know? Right? And then I think insightfully, Ishmael says, you know how to split atoms, to send explorers to the moon, to splice genes, but you don't know how people ought to live? That's right. Why is that? What does Mother Culture have to say? Right? And that's challenging. Right? The idea that we can and we have, as a civilization, as human beings, have done so much that seems to defy a lot of possibilities. And currently, right, there's other scientific moments going on. There's other investigations going on that really kind of can and do and yeah, and I mean, seemingly are really impressive, right? Considering the fact that this is by far the most important problem humankind has ever had to solve, you think there'd be a whole branch of science devoted to it, which there is. It's actually ethics. Instead, we find not a single one of you has ever wondered whether such knowledge is even out there to be obtained, right? The knowledge of how it is we ought to live. Excuse me. So now in section 6, and I'm on page 89, we now have in place all of the major elements of your culture's explanation story of how things came to be this way. The world was given to man, or humans, to turn into a paradise, but they screwed it up because they are fundamentally flawed. You might have been able to do something about this if you knew, blah, 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 but that knowledge is unattainable, right? So we're still kind of at this place of figuring out, well, how do we move forward? Okay, what other takeaways do we have here as it relates to thinking about mother culture and thinking about how it is we ought to live? All right. So we'll pause there. We'll move on to the aeronaut story after this.